Good morning. Hi, everybody. Good morning to you. Hello. How's everybody doing this morning? Just getting kind of settled here. It's pretty rainy here. I wonder how things are in other parts of the country. Good morning. Hi, Alyssa. Good morning. Nice to see you this morning. I have to have my Alyssa, my weekly dose at least, right? Good morning, everybody. I am so happy to be here and to introduce an extraordinary scholar who is talking about something really quite unusual. Julia Elsky, let's see here. Dr. Julia Elsky, is an assistant professor of French at Loyola University in Chicago. She holds a PhD in French from Yale University and a BA in French from Barnard College. And she publishes articles about émigré writers and Jewish identity in France. So this is a very interesting portal into the conversation that I have weekly on Banter with Beth about Holocaust awareness, bravery, courage, humanitarianism. This is something that is deeply important to me, of course, because of the film that I'm in post-production on right now, Would You Hide Me? And having very different points of view about the conversation regarding Holocaust awareness is fascinating, and I think terribly important that we continue the conversation and we all talk about it. So without further ado, I would like to bring on Dr. Julia Elsky, who is going to talk about her book, Writing Occupation, Jewish Emigre Voices in Wartime France. So let's bring her on. Let's see here. There we go. Julie. There we go, right there. Work. I'm sure it will. Hi, good morning to you.
Good morning. So nice to see you.
It's so nice to see you too, and nice to finally officially meet you. I know we kind of met a little bit over Zoom a few weeks ago when Alyssa hosted that amazing event, which I am so grateful for. Thank you, Alyssa. How are you this morning? And tell me, are you in Connecticut? Are you in New York? Where are you residing?
I'm actually in Massachusetts,
Nice,
on Cape
good.
Cod, which has been very peaceful and teaching remotely this semester.
Yes, definitely. That's wonderful. Good. Okay, so I want to start asking you just about you, like before we even dive into the book. Who are you and how did you get to be so interested in this topic, and what's your family story? What's your point of entry into this whole conversation?
I grew up in New York, in Riverdale in the Bronx. And you mentioned I went to Barnard College and I majored in French there. When I was little, I had a chance to travel in France, and I always loved French. It was always my favorite topic in school, and I continued with it. I also went to Jewish day school through high school. And so, Jewish identity, Jewish culture, and learning has always been an important part of my life. I guess when I was in college, I became really interested in one of the writers who I work on, Irene Nemirovsky, who was a Jewish immigrant from Russia to France. And I think that somehow, I don't have, aside from loving France and the French language, I don't have like a family connection in any way to France. But all of my grandparents immigrated to America from Eastern Europe in the interwar period. And I think somehow thinking about Jewishness and immigration, France brought together a lot of my interests in life, especially around this person, Irene Nemirovsky.
Right. Well, it's kind of hard not to love the wine and the cheese. So
that's true. Yes.
And the
baguette is my first love.
And the countryside and the whole thing. Yeah. It's very interesting. It's also interesting to talk about France in the context of World War II, and it's so easy for, I think, people to vilify France and suggesting that France was not, that they were complicit and not standing up. And of course, during World War II, we have to point at all of Europe. You can't single out any one country, I think, in terms of what they did or did not do. France, right, you know, there are so many stories, and there's actually this month in March is, I think it's the 25th anniversary of a documentary film that came out about the Chambon and how the town of Chambon, you know, was responsible for saving hundreds and hundreds of Jews. But there's so much anti-Semitism going on in the world today, and then we hear about these horrible things that are happening in France. And so I think that the book that you've written is such a fascinating testament to people who were trying to have a voice and what they were doing with that. So let's talk about writing occupation. First of all, what year was it published? I should know the answer to that question.
It was just published this past December, actually.
Okay, so this is brand spanking new. Okay, all right. Well, that's exciting. Mazel tov, and congratulations.
Thank you.
That's really wonderful. And writing occupation, the first thing that I need to learn about it, because you talk about it right off the bat, is this question of universalism and the language of universalism. And so for those of us that are not in the academic world of study that you're in, what does that mean? And universalism, the language of universalism, as opposed to what? What's the opposite of it? But tell us.
Right. Yeah. And just to kind of piggyback on what you had said earlier, I think one of what's so striking about looking at France during World War II is that you know, France is the country of universalism, of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And so the reversal of that during World War II is so striking. So universalism is the foundational idea of the Republic, the idea that all citizens are equal. You know, this is since the French Revolution. And so I mean, that's a very simplified answer, but it's one of the major legacies of the French Revolution and still important today. And it's what drew a lot of Jewish immigrants to France. There's a Yiddish expression, living like a Jew in France, because the Jews benefited from universal rights. Jews were given citizenship in 1790 and 1791. France is the first country to ever give citizenship to Jewish people. And so when we think of universalism, I think it's funny, right before we spoke, I was like, I bet she's going to ask me what French universalism is, and it's complicated, so I should have an idea. And I was actually very sad because every single thing I pulled up said the problems with French universalism. And it's very much a topic today, but I mean, universalism is what brought these people to France. They were able to have rights in a way that they didn't in their countries, or had maybe just been given rights in some countries. And so this is what drew a lot of the writers in writing occupation to France.
Gotcha. And so what were some of the problems? What are some of the critical points of view about it? Why would people think that people shouldn't have equal rights?
Well, I mean, this isn't necessarily what I talk about in the book, but I guess my point in the book is to show that French universal, this isn't the point of my book, but something I get into in my book is that French universalism didn't mean you could only be one thing. Like, you have to kind of deny any other identity and you're French. And when you accept that, then you have equal rights. So that's really not the case. In a lot of the research I did about the interwar period and other scholars I read, Jewish people were really thinking about what it meant to be French and Jewish at the same time, since the 19th century. And so I think that today sometimes people simplify what universalism means, or what secularism means, that it somehow means you have to deny other identities. But I have not found that to be the case in research. And there are a lot of important scholars who work on the 19th century and the 20th century who show how Jewish identity and French identity often work together. And like I said, this expression, living like a god in France, the Yiddish expression, really draws on the legacy of universalism.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. Okay, so the point of the book, and let's really unpack all of this. So you're writing about writers who are writing during the occupation.
Yeah.
You focus on primarily three writers, correct?
Five.
Five writers, yes, five writers, um, four of whom do use a Jewish voice when they're speaking, and one who does not.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
And so let's start there.
Sure. Yeah, so I look at especially five people who immigrated, Jewish writers or Jewish people. It's an interesting question, Jewish people, or are they Jewish writers, which I argue they are. But anyway, who immigrated to France in the interwar period and who switched to writing in French. And then I follow how their approach to writing changed during World War II. And one of the things that drew me to the project is that I saw there's a lot, there's a lot of scholarship writing research about immigrants in France, about pre-war immigration and post-war immigration. And it often felt, and also about Jewish writers in France, pre-war, post-war, especially about memory in the war. And it seemed like actually what people were writing during the war itself wasn't always treated as if the war were some kind of like black hole and these writers stopped writing. Many of them couldn't publish anymore, but they were still writing. And so I'm very interested in what they were writing about during the war.
Absolutely. Sure. And would you say, is this a fair thing to say that these five writers in particular, this is their form of resistance?
For some of them, yes. I mean, two of them were actually in the French resistance, one in the communist resistance within France, and one in Charles de Gaulle's resistance movement from London. And he, Romain Gary, who is one of my favorite writers, and I think if you're going to read one of them, I think he'd be the one definitely to read. His book that I focus on is called A European Education, and I argue that he's very much interested in thinking about what the role of Jews might be in the resistance. And so in that way, it's very much a resistance text. But then you might say for others, it is a kind of form of resistance because they're not allowed to publish. They are, in many ways, legally rejected from the nation. Yet they continue to write in French and think about what it meant to be in France. So it is resistant in a sense.
Sure. You go on to say, this is something I thought was really interesting. You say that there are three different forms of Jewish resistance: individuals who were Jewish and in the resistance, Jewish resistance organizations, and then resistance organizations with Jewish objectives whose members were not always exclusively Jewish.
Yeah. I would say the two people I study, fall into the category of having been Jewish and in the resistance, but they were not part of the various specifically Jewish resistance movements. But yeah, it's a really interesting question about what the role of Jews were in the resistance. Yeah.
Right.
I talk a little bit about the work of a scholar, Renee Poznansky, who talks about a kind of silence about Jewishness in the resistance. And so she's one of the writers who really talks a lot about, and I drew a lot on her work, about the role of Jews in the French resistance, or the very different kinds of resistance movements in France. And she talks about how, there were a lot of reasons for not overtly saying we're fighting for Jews from people who weren't doing it for that reason, but also a feeling that you have to reach the widest number of people possible, and by saying we're fighting to save Jews, you wouldn't reach the largest number of people.
Right.
That isn't to say that Jewish people weren't involved in the resistance, which she shows they very much were.
Right. Yes. So when you began your research on the topic, I think process is always something so fascinating with any kind of a writer, artist, creative, scholar. What were some of the things along the way that you were surprised that they came easier to you? And what were some of the things along the way that you were like, oh my God, I can't crack this one?
That's a good question. Well, I wouldn't say I was surprised by this, but I really loved working in archives. I loved getting to work in the archives of these writers. one especially, Benjamin Fondant, his papers, half of his papers are in this amazing archive right on the Place du Panthéon. So you can like see out this like symbol of universalism while reading his papers, but also he revised a lot of his poems during the war, including ones he had published. So he has like the published book, and then he writes his revisions of his poems. So you could like see his thought process and how he's changing what he's writing about during the war. And that was just really very moving. He writes in his notes something like, I don't even know if this will get finished or if it will be published. And there's an element of like unfinished business there. And it was very moving to see it, and felt very. So there's that aspect. And then, but I realized it's very hard when you collect all this archival material to put it together into a narrative and to figure out what your point is. That was I kind of naively thought I'd find all this stuff and then I'd have a book, but it's not how it works.
Right. Now you have to actually sit down and make sense of all of it.
Yeah.
Especially for someone else to understand, right?
Right, yeah. Right.
Or even, I think so often don't we find that we write, or perhaps that I shouldn't put words in your mouth, but I have known writers who write only for the purpose of trying to make the thoughts clearer in their own minds. And that process then therefore is available and offered to another reader to help them make sense of things in their own minds.
Yeah, I wanted to write something that would be maybe something that college-age students would be able to read, the widest kind of audience I could. And so I just noticed my phone is about to die. I'm so embarrassed.
Oh, do you have a charger?
I do, but I need to grab it.
Go grab the charger. One. That's okay. We can take questions from the audience. Go grab your charger. Go for it. So who has a question? Put your question in the chat, you guys, so that I can make sure that we ask Julia this question.
This is very new to me.
Any questions popping up? Well, you talk about wanting to reach the widest audience with college students in particular. And so that's perfect that you're talking about Fondant, because then one of the things that I read that I loved was the Romanian-born Fondant. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Fondant, who comes to France and lives in France and starts to write in France, says, in the bars, they served foreign languages and cocktails. Here, foreign language is as intoxicating as alcohol. I thought that was really beautiful.
And it's something I very much, that speaks to me as a French learner, how exciting it is. I thought, you know, in his interwar writing, Fondant really shows the excitement of being in Paris in the interwar period. I talked about how a lot of these writers came for rights, to have like civil rights in France, but also to be at a center of cultural life, a major European center. And when he comes to France, there's this real excitement that he conveys. And yeah, I love that line as well.
I mean, it's beautiful. It's beautiful because it's so true. Whenever we travel to any other country, some people really adopt the dialect, and they want to be, as you know, you're on holiday, you're like, oh, well, I can live this way. I can buy my baguette and flowers and bottled wine every day. And then we come back to America and we go to Costco, we buy a case, like whatever. But when we're in these different countries, I think that's part of the romance of travel, is that you actually are breathing in the language. You're breathing in the breath of how people sigh and communicate and behave with each other. There's one question in the chat here that someone wants to know about your chapter on accents, on dialect. Do you want to speak a little bit about that chapter?
Yeah, for sure. So the line you quoted from Fondant is such a joyous kind of coming to French, right? And French really also stands for a lot of these writers. The language stands for, rights and universalism and a center of cultural life. And, this changes a little bit during the war because of the weight of being a foreigner in France. If you weren't a citizen, you didn't have those rights necessarily. And I have a chapter. I think Elsa asked that. It's my new favorite chapter to think about. But it's about Marseille and the writer Jean Malaquet's representation of Jewish refugees and European refugees more generally in Marseille during the beginning of the occupation of France. So Marseille was really, if Paris was like the center of cultural life in the interwar period, Marseille becomes a center of cultural life during the occupation because Parisian intellectuals and writers and artists fled to the southern zone where Marseille was. And then many people were trying to get out of Europe through Marseille, through the port of Marseille or through going over the Pyrenees. And so Jean Malaquet kind of represents the multilingualism of Marseille in this period and how accents really played a major role in how people experienced the city, either responding to like the sounds of accents around them or people thinking of their own accents and how it might make them, stand out as a refugee.
Sure.
And Malaquet kind of is writing against the extreme far right's xenophobic, anti-Semitic writing about like, oh, these people can't speak French correctly, or their accents show how they're degrading the French language and French life. And he kind of shows how that's not the case at all, that accents are the source of a rich identity of play, expressions of love. So
that's so
a
beautiful.
little bit about the chapter.
Sure. There was another.
It's a really interesting novel.
Sorry, go ahead. Say that again.
Oh, I said it's a really interesting novel. It's called World Without Visa.
World Without Visa. Yeah. World Without Visa.
Mm-hmm.
And that author's name is, you said it so beautifully. I'm going to butcher it if I try and say it.
It's his pen name, but Jean Malaquet.
Jean Malaquet. That's beautiful. Yeah. Okay. So people can look at that. Now, why is Gary your favorite writer? Or I butchered that last name too, didn't I?
No. Oh, he is so funny. Oh man, Gary. He's just like, just eat up his novels. He just has this amazing sense of humor in his writing, and sometimes the humor conveys like the poignancy of the moment or how painful it is, but he does it often through humor. And the book of his that I write about is called The European Education, but Promise at Dawn is a kind of autobiographical novel, and I highly recommend it. And there was recently a film made of it with Charlotte Gainsbourg. So.
Oh, really?
But I think the humor, yeah. So I think the humor in Gary is I really love.
Sure. So let's talk about the magnum opus that you referred to in the book, the Nemirovsky piece.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And so this is something, what my question is about Suite Française is, this is a woman who wrote void of a Jewish voice, so made the conscious choice not to, absent of Jewish characters, but then perished at Auschwitz in 1943. And so I am curious, and I know that one of our listeners here is also curious to know if everybody survived the war. Obviously, she did not. However, my question is, so she's writing absent of Jewish characters, presumably so that she doesn't get caught. Yes, no, maybe. And so you can debunk my theory.
Maybe
it's interesting. Yeah, and so in many ways it makes me think of passing, people that are trying to pass as. But can you imagine, since she was, deported and murdered, all of that terribly hard work to negate what is part of her own truth, which is being Jewish, is all for naught because she is indeed murdered. She doesn't survive. So can you imagine what her work might have been like had she included Jewish characters?
Mm, that's interesting. She's such an interesting she's such an interesting figure. She died, Benjamin von Dahn died as well, both in Auschwitz. The other authors happily survived the war. But so in the interwar period, Nemirovsky wrote a lot about immigrants and Jews in France. And since she's kind of been rediscovered in the early 2000s, and republished, there's been a lot of debate around her because she does have what might be stereotypically anti-Semitic themes, right? Or some people would argue that she's self-hating, that she writes about Jews who love money because they're Jews or things like that. And then there are a lot of other people who say she's kind of representing ambivalence about her position in France, or the ways in which Jews are sometimes rejected, Jewish immigrants are sometimes rejected. And I think it's not a case of just like self-hatred, but a case of a really interesting ambivalence in her writing. And I don't think you can say she's anti-Semitic or self-hating. But some of her most interesting writing from the interwar period is about Jews. And then her major work, which was not published in her lifetime, and it's kind of amazing how it was discovered, was about the beginning of the occupation, and it has no Jews in it and no mention of Jews. And there are a lot of different ideas about why did she stop writing about Jewish people. So and again, I don't think you could say not writing about Jewish people shows you are self-hating Jew. That doesn't make any sense to me. But some scholars who I would agree with, and I can do the same thing, say she's showing the rejection of Jews from France. Or also, she did continue to publish under a fake name, and so she had to support herself, and she couldn't really write about Jewish people and publish in the beginning of the war under a fake name. So there are a lot of reasons there, but it is horrible. Like you can see, I argue that there's a kind of absence of Jews in her writing and in the war. But she wrote so many short stories, and they're all about absence or displacement. And I think it's a way of writing about herself. And it is really tragic to think of how she was deported and died, and how troubled she was in thinking about Jewishness and Frenchness. Yeah. It's amazing how her book was.
Is there any possibility, I mean, not having read it, I've never even heard of her before, so this is all an education for me. Is there any possibility that she would have a satirical point of view in terms of her, if you're suggesting that she's not self-loathing and you're suggesting that she's not anti-Semitic, then perhaps this is all just satire couched in exquisite language or intellectual language. I don't know.
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, she herself said in interviews in the 1930s, like, I'm writing about Jewish bankers because this is a world I know. Her father was a Jewish banker, and she married a Jewish banker or someone in finance. So she's like, this is the world I know, so I'm writing about it. But I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm proud that I'm Jewish. So I don't know if satire, I feel like sometimes she satirizes the French sometimes more. But I don't know. It's an interesting idea though. Interesting.
I mean, the only reason I started thinking about that is because you're also an expert in theater of the absurd. Is that correct? I mean, that's another field of study for you, right?
Yeah, that's my next project. Yeah, is
That's
about
your
the theater
next
of the
project.
absurd and
Okay.
the art.
Okay. Right. Gotcha. So what is the story about how her manuscript was discovered in the early 2000s?
So it was published in the early 2000s. It was
Okay.
discovered a little earlier. Her daughters survived the war in hiding, and they, after the war, got kind of her papers, and they had what they thought was her diary, but could never bring themselves to read it because it was too painful. And then in the 70s, they said, "Okay, we're gonna read this together." And they opened it and they realized it wasn't a diary at all, actually her novel. And interestingly, I think Romain Gary was a fan of her writing. Before, he died before she was rediscovered. He died in 1980, I think, or yeah, in 1980. So, but he knew of her work even before, like when she had still been totally forgotten. So in any case, her daughters discovered this in, I think, the 70s or the 80s, and then in the early 2000s it was published and became a huge bestseller. She was the first person to ever posthumously win the Prix Renaudot. It's an important literary prize in France, and translated into English by Sandra Smith, who's done beautiful translations of Nemirovsky's work. So it's a really moving story also.
Sure. If you were to give us a sound bite, like this is so mean to do to you on Instagram Live, but like a 1 or 2 sentence description of what her book is about, what's it about?
Sure. It's about the first half is about Parisians leaving France in the civilian flight from Paris in June 1940 at the moment of the defeat, and she follows different families and their paths and stories from Paris into the countryside. Sure. And then the second half is a little bit later during the occupation, or a little into the occupation, and one of the main topics is about a young woman who's living with her mother-in-law and a Nazi soldier stationed in their house, and her reactions to the soldier. So it's a really amazing book. There are not that many literary representations written like at that moment in time, depicting that moment in time. There are very few literary representations of the civilian flight from Paris written during the war itself. Sure. So feels very immediate.
Yes. Speaking of immediacy, let's bring all of these things from the 30s and 40s into today. This is a great question that Alyssa has actually asked. How are these authors received in their native countries today?
Good question. I think Fondan, who was a pretty, he was an avant-garde writer in Romania before he came to France, and he's still considered an important poet, writer of the Romanian avant-garde. I don't know so much about the other writers. I really focus on their lives in France, right? So
sure,
I could answer more clearly about how they're received in France. I think some of them have been forgotten, like Fondan is not well known. Jean Malaquais, totally forgotten, I think, for the most part, in France. Romain Gary is still considered a really important writer. Sometimes people don't know that he wasn't born in France, but he's a really important writer, very popular. Nemirovsky became popular in the early 2000s, but she had been forgotten. And then Elsa Triolet is like complicated. She's often known as the wife of Louis Aragon, the very famous poet. And she's known, but kind of out of fashion, I would say. One of the most infuriating things I read was she was the first woman to win the Prix Goncourt, which is the most important literary prize. She won it in the first award season after the end of the occupation. And there was a headline at the time that was like, Louis Aragon's wife wins Prix Goncourt, which is very frustrating to see. But anyway, she's known, but she's, you know, a lot of her books aren't in print, and she's not really in fashion, I would say. But
Are there any? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I was going to say, I think that
you keep talking.
They achieved what they wanted to be, which were French writers. I think they really were French authors, and so that's I guess why I've thought more about, you know, how they're received in France today. Sure. But a really good question about their countries of origin. Yeah.
Yes. And what do you think in terms of the parallels for today and how people are writing about the current events of the day today? Are there any parallels that you are finding in terms of if we are suggesting that perhaps these voices, these emigre voices, are writing in not their native tongue, but a new language, and it is perhaps a form of resistance? Do you see any parallels with what's happening in the world today?
Yeah, I hope this answers your question. When I finished the first draft of my book, I was actually in Germany on a postdoc, and I was there in 2015, 2016, that academic year, which was an important moment in the refugee crisis. I don't know if you can even call it a crisis because it's been a long-standing thing, but it was around when Germany took in a really high number of refugees. And so there was a lot of discussion about the presence of refugees in Germany. And the news, I feel like it was constantly compared to World War II, or constantly this idea that this is the largest wave of refugees in the world since World War II. And so I think if we want to compare it to the experience of World War II, I think it's really important to think about how refugees themselves wrote about the war, how they experienced displacement, the question of in what language to write in. I think it's really important to understand how refugees in the past addressed these questions and can learn from this.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I just want to
really humanizes
the experience. Yes, absolutely. Is there, I have one more thing that I want to say right here before we finish, but before I say this final thing, is there anything else that you would love for us to know about the book?
Let's see. I guess kind of what I started with, that these writers continued to think about their positions during the war, that the war wasn't just kind of this black hole of nothingness, but that they were individuals who had real points of view and really struggled with the question of what it meant to be Jewish, to be an immigrant, to be a writer, to be a French writer, and that the war really didn't silence them.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Where can people get the book? Is it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble? How can
you can
people
get it? Oh.
Yeah, show the cover.
Show the cover. Amazon.
Show the cover.
You can get it through Stanford. Oh yeah.
Beautiful. And it's a beautiful cover, by the way.
Yeah, it's from Stanford University Press. You can also get it on their website. I'm grateful they did a really beautiful job with the production of it. So yeah, Amazon, Stanford. I think there are also bookstores that carry it. Yeah.
Good. Is there any possibility of perhaps it ever becoming an audiobook, do you think?
Oh, I don't know. It's a good question. I can ask my my editor. It is also available as an ebook.
Oh, as an ebook as well. The reason I'm asking about audio is because of, like, just even hearing you speak in French. For those of us that don't speak French, or we speak really
horrible travel French, you know, it would be so wonderful to hear the sounds of the language as we're listening to the stories. I'm one of these people where even though I might get an audiobook, I still buy the book too. Because first of all, I love books. And second of all, I like to be able to go back and like, wait, what did that character say? And then go back that way. So I kind of do them in tandem and stuff like that. But what I want to leave us all with here is, let me find this quote. I love how you began your epilogue. You say, I belong to that particular generation of Jews who have the duty to speak Yiddish, my mother tongue, in a tongue at once familiar and foreign, French. Can you speak about that quote a little bit?
Sure, that's a quote from the writer Miriam Anisimov, and it's from her essay, A Yiddish Writer Who Writes in French, and it's published in a collection called Voices of the Diaspora. It really depicts some of what I was trying to show in my book, that the idea of thinking of French as a Jewish language. Often in Jewish studies, you talk about Jewish bilingualism. So the idea of Yiddish and Hebrew bilingualism, or bilingualism of Hebrew or Yiddish and another language. And so in my book, I really kind of compare writers who are writing maybe in Romanian and French, but not Yiddish and French, right? But that somehow is a form of Jewish bilingualism. And I think that Anisimov's quote is so amazing because it shows how Yiddish identity can resonate within French, how there's space for this in the French language. And I think that some of the authors, especially Malaké, were trying to show this, and she presents it in a really fascinating way in the post-war period.
Wonderful.
So I kind of end with how a lot of the questions these writers were thinking about during the war are still questions they think about after.
Yes. Well, I think we're all just trying to uncover the human condition and how we can together move the needle forward towards a more equal and just society on every level. Right. And it seems as though these writers have done an extraordinary job of doing that. Well, congratulations to you on the recent publication of your wonderful book, Writing Occupation, Jewish Emigre Voices in Wartime France. And you can get it at Stanford University Press or on Amazon. Julia Elsky, thank you so much for your research, for your scholarship, and your contribution to the arts, and your contribution to Jewish identity. And it's something that is so important right now, that those of us who feel the need to identify as a Jewish people, that we do so with unfettered joy. And it really, your book really points towards that. So thank you very, very much for your contributions. I want to say bye.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. You guys are so wonderful for showing up for Dr. Elsky and for Banter with Beth. I'm so grateful. What else do we have on tap this week? Next Wednesday on Banter with Beth, we have another extraordinary scholar. Karen Remler will be joining us, and we'll be talking about Jewish memory and all the contributions of how memory is unpacked with regard to the Holocaust. So thanks everybody for tuning in. As always, now Julia, sorry about this. Do you have a website that people can go to? Oops, are you still there? You're frozen. You're frozen. Okay, well, you guys, if you're trying to find Dr. Elsky and you can't find her, just ping me here on Instagram Live and I'll get you over to her. Okay, But thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. And thank you again, Julia, for joining us today. Okay, bye.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Pleasure. Bye.